August 1944. The fields near Falaise were silent for a moment, an eerie calm before the storm. In the gray dawn, a group of weary Wehrmacht officers stood on the edge of a shallow ridge, staring across a valley packed with retreating German columns. Tractors, trucks, horses, men, thousands of them, choked the narrow roads, desperate to escape the closing Allied trap. Then, from the distance, came the deep, metallic thunder that would haunt them forever. American artillery opened fire. Within seconds, the air turned into a wall of sound. Hundreds of shells screamed overhead, tearing into the valley below. Fire and steel erupted everywhere. Trucks igniting like torches, ammunition wagons exploding into clouds of shrapnel. The ground trembled under the relentless rhythm of American 150mm guns firing in perfect unison. Officers shouted orders no one could hear, their voices lost beneath the mechanical roar of destruction. In less than 20 minutes, thousands of German soldiers vanished into smoke and silence. Those who survived stumbled through the burning wreckage, stunned and sleepless, unable to comprehend what had just happened. And as night fell over Normandy, the men who had once commanded armies realized they had witnessed the death of their own. By mid-1944, the war in Western Europe had turned into a relentless pursuit. After the Allied landings in Normandy on June 6th, the beaches that had once seemed fragile footholds became gateways to an unstoppable advance. American, British, and Canadian divisions pushed inland, carving through hedgerows, villages, and farmlands that had sheltered German defenses for 4 long years. The Wehrmacht, once the symbol of unstoppable precision, was bleeding from every front. Hitler's promise that the Atlantic Wall would hold forever had crumbled within days. The Americans had introduced something new to the battlefield, a level of artillery coordination the Germans had never experienced. Backed by radar, observation aircraft, and mobile command trucks, U.S. field artillery could deliver perfectly timed barrages over miles of terrain. Each gun section worked like part of a living machine. Within minutes, coordinates transmitted by forward observers could bring down thousands of shells onto a single grid square. It was warfare stripped of heroism, efficient, mathematical, and devastating. The German command, overstretched and fragmented, struggled to react. Communication lines were constantly broken by Allied air raids. Armored divisions meant for counterattack were instead forced into chaotic retreats. General Feldmarschall Günther von Kluge, commanding Army Group B, faced the impossible task of holding Western France with shattered units and dwindling fuel. Every report he received from the front told the same story: collapse, confusion, and the relentless pressure of Allied fire. American forces under General Omar Bradley were moving south from Cayenne and west from Avranches, intent on trapping the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army in what would soon be called the Falaise Pocket. It was not a single battle, but a slow tightening of an enormous noose. Day after day, German troops withdrew eastward, believing they could still escape toward the River Seine. They did not realize the Allies were already waiting to close the final gap. As the Germans moved through the narrow valleys between Trun, Chambois, and Falaise, the Americans prepared their guns. Hundreds of M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers, 109mm and 155mm field pieces, and British batteries were aligned in open fields. Engineers laid communication wires and calculated trajectories. The Allied commanders had learned to think in terms of grids and timing, not faces or names. To them, the trapped German columns were targets, not men. In those same hours, German officers at the front could sense the weight of history pressing down. Their maps meant nothing now. Fuel shortages left tanks abandoned by the roadside. Horses pulled artillery pieces that once had been towed by trucks. The retreating soldiers were exhausted, hungry, and demoralized, yet still obedient. They trusted their leaders to find a way out of the tightening encirclement. But the Americans had mastered something far more decisive than courage: coordination. Their fire missions could be launched in seconds, corrected in real time by reconnaissance aircraft circling high above the smoke. A single radio transmission could direct dozens of batteries onto a target area smaller than a village square. The Wehrmacht had never faced such organized annihilation. By August 18th, the Allies had nearly sealed the pocket. The Germans were trapped in an area barely 10 miles wide, their only exit a single road leading through the village of Chambois. Columns of men and vehicles jammed every path, stretching for miles. Civilians fled in the same confusion, blending with soldiers, tanks, and horses. Above them, the sound of Allied aircraft never ceased, engines droning like vultures circling carrion. Still, German commanders clung to hope. Orders came from Berlin insisting on holding positions that no longer existed. Hitler's obsession with no retreat transformed the battlefield into a slaughterhouse. Officers argued among themselves, some pleading to break out while there was still time, others fearing court-martial for defiance. It was during these final hours that American forward observers spotted the columns massing in the valley. Through their binoculars, they saw endless movement, trucks, artillery, and men crowding together in desperation. To the Americans, it was the perfect artillery target. To the Germans, it was their last chance to live. The call for fire went out across the Allied network. Radio operators relayed coordinates, range, and weather conditions. Gun crews locked in their sights. The valley near Falaise, soon to be known as the graveyard of the German army in France, fell under the shadow of the guns. And in that tense moment before the first shells landed, time seemed to hold its breath. The encirclement that would later be called the Falaise Pocket was not a single strike, but a convergence of desperation. On one side, American and Canadian forces were determined to close the gap. On the other, tens of thousands of German soldiers fought to escape the trap. Between them lay a corridor no wider than a few miles, a stretch of farmland, orchards, and villages turned into a killing ground. By August 19th, the situation for the German 7th Army had become catastrophic. Reports arriving at headquarters described entire divisions reduced to fragments. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, once a proud elite unit, had lost most of its tanks. The 85th Infantry Division existed now only on paper. Supply columns were destroyed by Allied aircraft before they could reach the front. The Germans who managed to cross the fields did so at night, terrified of being spotted by the constant Allied patrols overhead. The Allied air superiority made movement almost impossible. American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons strafed the roads at dawn and dusk, targeting anything that moved. Even the smallest convoys were attacked without mercy. For the German troops, there was no shelter. Trees offered no protection, ditches filled with corpses, and the smell of fuel and death lingered everywhere. Those who had once marched across Europe in triumph were now reduced to crawling through hedges, clutching helmets, praying for darkness. Still, the Germans fought with grim discipline. Commanders like General Paul Hauser, head of the 7th Army, tried to maintain order among the chaos. Hauser himself would be wounded in the face while leading men through the encirclement. He later described the battlefield as a chamber of horror. Units were breaking apart, reforming under fire, and moving blindly through shell-pocked terrain. There was no longer a front line. Only survival. Across the Allied side, the artillerymen prepared for what was about to come. The U.S. First Army's Artillery Command had perfected a method of time-on-target bombardment, ensuring that every shell from hundreds of guns would strike the target simultaneously. This required exact synchronization between divisions, down to the second. It was a triumph of communication, mathematics, and logistics, a system no other army had mastered to this scale. For the Americans, this was not vengeance, but procedure. Their observers calculated positions, verified wind direction, and marked the German movements on their maps. Each cluster of vehicles or soldiers became a coordinate. The men handling the guns often never saw the destruction they caused. They were miles away, following orders with mechanical precision, Yet they knew the effect. They had seen the aftermath before: shattered helmets, twisted steel, and scorched earth where entire regiments once stood. The Germans trapped near Chambois had no such detachment. As dusk approached on August 20th, officers ordered their men to move toward the final escape route, a narrow strip of road that led east toward the Seine. Thousands poured onto it. Tanks, half-tracks, carts, and refugees clogged the lanes. The sound of engines mixed with shouts and cries, a rolling human wave trying to outrun the inevitable. To the west, American artillery spotters confirmed the coordinates. To the east, Canadian and Polish forces were closing in. The corridor was shrinking by the hour. The German commanders realized that they were not retreating anymore. They were being hunted. In the last hours before the storm, the landscape grew strangely still. Smoke from distant fires drifted low over the fields, dimming the sunset. Horses whinnied in fear as shell casings rattled inside wagons. Men sat silently on the roadside, clutching their rifles without purpose. Somewhere among them, officers scanned the sky, waiting for the next wave of attacks. They did not know that within minutes, every gun within range, from the American 105mm howitzers to the British 25-pounders, would converge on this exact location. The Valley of Falaise would become a furnace of steel and fire. And as darkness settled over the hills, the order came through the radio lines. The operators repeated the coordinates. The gunners adjusted their sights. The last light of the day faded into black, and the ground began to tremble under the first distant rumble of American artillery. The storm had begun. The men who lived through those 20 minutes described it as something beyond war, a moment when human reason could no longer explain what they were seeing. The German officers who had commanded campaigns across Europe, who had seen cities fall and armies surrender, now stood paralyzed before an enemy that destroyed not with rifles or courage, but with invisible mathematics. For the first time, they felt what it meant to be utterly powerless in the face of industrial war. One survivor from the 21st Panzer Division wrote later that the sky seemed to split open in waves. It began with a deep rolling rumble, then a sudden scream that tore through the air. The ground lifted, the horizon vanished in smoke, and the familiar world turned into chaos. Men disappeared mid-sentence. Trucks became clouds of fire. Horses burst into flames where they stood. Those who tried to crawl for cover were swallowed by the explosions that followed. It was not one barrage. It was hundreds, overlapping, systematic. Every square of earth seemed targeted, every breath matched by an incoming shell. From the American side, the process was coldly precise. Forward observers in Piper Cubs and ground positions relayed the adjustments in real time. Batteries recalculated angles and rates of fire with slide rules and field telephones. Gun crews worked in rhythm, their arms blistered from heat, their ears ringing from the constant concussion. To them, it was another mission, another grid to clear before moving on. They had no faces for the men they were killing, only coordinates and results. When the command, "Fire for effect," came, every barrel thundered together, creating a wall of sound that rolled across the countryside like a mechanical heartbeat. This was the tactical GETU. Genius of American artillery in 1944. Overwhelming concentration of fire, instantaneous correction, and sustained volume. The Germans had long prided themselves on discipline and tactical brilliance, but they could not match this kind of organized annihilation. Their counter-battery guns were gone, their ammunition low, their communication broken. All that remained was endurance. Yet endurance meant nothing when the air itself was lethal. Among the German officers, disbelief turned to horror. Some had commanded at Kursk, others in the Balkans or Russia, but nothing compared to this. They had once believed artillery was a supporting arm, a way to soften defenses before the infantry attack. But the Americans had turned it into the main weapon of destruction. It was not a prelude to battle anymore. It was the battle itself. Entire divisions could be erased without a single rifle being fired. As the barrage continued, the valley below Falaise disappeared beneath a storm of dust and smoke. Flames rose higher than the trees, illuminating the night in unnatural colors. The noise was beyond comprehension, a constant rolling roar that made men bleed from their ears. Even miles away, Allied infantry could feel the vibration in their boots. Some German officers later confessed they had forgotten to give orders. They simply watched, frozen, as the fire consumed everything. When the shelling finally slowed, the silence that followed felt unbearable. The field that had once been alive with motion was now a wasteland. The smell of cordite, smoke, and burning fuel hung thick in the air. The wounded screamed for help that would never come. One American observer noted that through his binoculars, the entire valley looked like a single crater. Yet behind this horror lay a method. The Americans had not chosen the valley by chance. Their spotter planes had tracked German movements for hours. They knew the enemy was concentrating along that route. Thousands of men, vehicles, and horses trying to flee. The decision to unleash the full weight of the artillery was not emotional. It was strategic. By destroying the retreating columns, the Allies ensured that the Wehrmacht in France would never recover. For the German High Command, it was a revelation of defeat. Reports arriving from the front were incoherent, full of static and half-words. Some officers tried to organize rescue parties, but were forced back by new shelling. In headquarters dugouts, maps were covered with red pencil marks indicating lost contact with divisions. It was the sound of the German army dying. Even among the Americans, there was a quiet realization that something irreversible had happened. Many gunners, after the mission ended, sat in silence beside their weapons. They had done their duty, followed every order, but the scale of destruction was beyond imagination. One corporal wrote home that night, "It looked like the earth was eating men alive." For the Germans, there would be no recovery from this moment. The officers who survived would carry the memory for the rest of their lives. The sound, the heat, the helplessness. Many never spoke of it again. Those who did said they stopped sleeping afterward, haunted not only by the sight of death, but by the realization that the war they had once fought with pride had turned into pure, mechanical extermination. The valley at Falaise became a grave without crosses. And as the smoke lifted, the truth of the modern battlefield was laid bare. Precision had replaced valor, and numbers had replaced hope. When the guns finally went silent, those who remained alive were changed men. The survivors of the bombardment stumbled through the debris in shock, their faces gray with ash, their ears deafened, their uniforms torn by shrapnel. They were not soldiers anymore, just fragments of a defeated army wandering through a world that no longer resembled the one they had known. The psychological toll was immeasurable. No training, no ideology, no officer's speech could explain what they had endured. They had witnessed the end of their army and the collapse of everything they had believed about war. Among the prisoners captured in the days that followed were officers who refused to speak, staring blankly at their captors. Some trembled uncontrollably. Allied interrogators later noted that many were suffering from what would now be recognized as acute combat trauma, an exhaustion so deep that it silenced their will. A few tried to describe what they had seen. The shells did not stop. They fell everywhere. Men disappeared. I saw whole units vanish. Others simply said nothing. They could not find the words. This was the human angle of Falaise, the unseen war that continued inside the minds of those who lived through it. The German military ethos of iron discipline had taught its soldiers to suppress fear, to endure, to obey. But even that tradition broke under the sheer magnitude of the American onslaught. Some officers wrote later that they no longer blamed their men for fleeing. Anyone who has not stood under such fire, one captain confessed, cannot imagine what courage means when it no longer matters. While the German soldiers endured the unimaginable, the Allied command observed the operation as a triumph of coordination. Generals like Omar Bradley and Bernard Montgomery had learned from the bloodshed of earlier campaigns that precision could save Allied lives. By combining aerial reconnaissance, radar-guided corrections, and the vast logistics of American industry, they had created a war machine that delivered destruction on a scale the world had never seen. Bradley once remarked that artillery was the god of war, echoing words once attributed to Stalin, but now in the hands of the Allies, that god had become almost omnipotent. Behind the technology, there was also a moral weight. Some American officers who toured the aftermath of Falaise later admitted they felt both pride and revulsion. The success of the operation could not erase the scenes that followed. Twisted vehicles still smoking, the bodies of horses and men tangled together, entire roads buried beneath wreckage. War correspondents who entered the valley days later described it as a place where death had lost count. Even hardened veterans stood in silence. One reporter wrote, "The smell alone told the story of 1,000 endings." The lead, Airship Engel, was equally revealing. On the German side, what remained of command had disintegrated. Field Marshal von Kluge, overwhelmed by the disaster and unable to contact Berlin, disappeared shortly after leaving his headquarters. He was later found dead, an apparent suicide. Hitler's unrealistic orders to hold every position had driven his field commanders into despair. Instead of an organized withdrawal, the German army had been forced into a trap of its own making. The officers who survived understood too late that obedience had become their enemy. On the Allied side, discipline and adaptability defined every move. Eisenhower's broad front strategy, often criticized for being cautious, had now proven devastating. The Americans and their partners had achieved exactly what they intended: to destroy not just a position, but the enemy's ability to fight again. The Falaise pocket was not simply a battlefield victory. It was a surgical amputation of German power in the West. Yet the moral dimension lingered long after the guns cooled. What did it mean to win a war in which technology could erase thousands of lives in minutes? The American artillerymen who had fired those rounds carried mixed feelings. Some felt vindicated. The faster the enemy was destroyed, the sooner the war would end. Others felt unease, wondering whether they had witnessed efficiency or extermination. The line between the two seemed thin. Historians later debated whether such overwhelming firepower was necessary. The Allies could have allowed more Germans to surrender, but command decisions favored total annihilation of enemy formations to prevent regrouping. It was ruthless logic, cold but effective. The death toll, estimated between 5,000 and 10,000 within hours, broke the remaining strength of the German army in France. For the Wehrmacht, the experience changed everything. Their officers, once confident in tactical brilliance and battlefield finesse, now understood that the war had moved beyond human control. Precision, machines, and logistics had replaced genius and courage. The age of maneuver had ended. The age of mass fire had begun. The soldiers of the Falaise pocket were among the last to fight in the old way, relying on endurance, intuition, and pride. They were destroyed by a system that turned war into purr. In that noise, they had felt the death of their army and the death of an idea, the myth of invincibility that had carried them across Europe. The American guns had done more than end a battle. They had revealed the future of warfare, where machines would decide outcomes long before men could act. And as the survivors limped away through the wreckage, that realization followed them like a shadow. They would never escape. The morning of August 20th broke under a pale sun that gave no warmth. Mist clung to the valley, softening the outlines of burned trees and shattered vehicles. For a moment, the silence was deceptive, as if the battlefield itself hesitated between death and awakening. But deep behind the American lines, the gun crews were already awake, adjusting sights, loading shells, and waiting for the command that would change everything. At 0700 hours, the first fire missions were confirmed. Forward observers high above in Piper Cub aircraft had tracked dense concentrations of German movement along the Tronchambois road. The coordinates were precise. Range, elevation, and target density all noted. Radio operators relayed the data through networks that hummed with efficiency. Command posts checked wind speeds and atmospheric pressure. Each variable was calculated. Each gun crew waited for the same word: fire. The order came at 0712. The first shells screamed out across the valley, followed by hundreds more. Within seconds, the entire horizon erupted. The American artillery system, stretching for miles, unleashed its full strength. More than 600 guns firing in coordinated waves. Each battery followed strict timing, every salvo landing within fractions of a second of the last. To the men trapped below, it felt like the world was ending. The German convoy, jammed with trucks, tanks, carts, and thousands of men, disintegrated instantly. Explosions tore through the line, flipping vehicles, scattering bodies, setting fuel, tanks alight. The air turned orange and black as fire spread from one wreck to another. Horses bolted through the flames before collapsing mid-stride. Men tried to run but found nowhere to go. Each direction brought another blast. American gunners operated with mechanical precision. The M7 Priest crews fired shell after shell, the guns recoiling, the barrels glowing red. Spent casings piled at their feet. The smell of burnt powder filled the air. Observers reported corrections. Left 200, add 50. Adjustments were made instantly. The coordination was flawless. It was no longer individual units fighting separate battles. It was one immense, synchronized engine of destruction. Within 10 minutes, the valley was an inferno. Fuel trucks exploded in towering flames. Artillery shells stored in German wagons detonated, sending fragments in every direction. The continuous detonation shook the ground for miles. Some American soldiers later said they could feel the vibration in their chests. Others described the sight through binoculars as a storm of dust and fire eating the earth. German officers trapped with their men could do nothing. Communications had collapsed. Radios were silent, wires severed. Orders shouted were drowned by the blast waves. Some officers tried to organize counterfire, but their guns were gone, destroyed in the first few minutes. Others simply knelt beside the road, stunned, unable to understand how the entire front had vanished around them. A captain from the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division wrote later that it was as if the sky had turned into a machine. Every explosion came from nowhere, perfectly placed, perfectly timed. He said he could not hear his own voice, even when screaming. When the barrage paused briefly, men crawled from ditches, only for another wave to strike. It was relentless, systematic, without pause for mercy. By 0732, the main barrage was over. In 20 minutes, the valley that had once held nearly 8,000 German troops was silent. Smoke obscured the morning sun, casting a gray pall over everything. Fires burned unchecked. The ground was cratered, black and steaming. Survivors wandered aimlessly, many without weapons or helmets, their eyes vacant. Horses lay dead in rows, and trucks still smoldered, their metal frames twisted beyond recognition. For the American command, the mission was an unquestionable success. Reports came in of massive destruction and complete disruption of German retreat routes. The objective, to prevent enemy escape eastward, had been achieved with brutal perfection. Artillerymen rechecked their logs, cleaned their guns, and waited for the next order. Few spoke about what they had just done. For the Germans, it was the end of cohesion. No unit remained intact. Even officers who had survived could no longer organize resistance. The landscape itself had turned against them. Cratered fields, burning wrecks, and smoke so thick that men lost all sense of direction. Some wandered straight into Allied lines to surrender, unable to continue. Others lay motionless among the debris, their bodies blending with the wreckage. Later, when Allied infantry entered the valley, they found scenes that defied description. The road was carpeted with destruction so dense that vehicles drove over the dead, because there was no other way through. Shell holes were filled with bodies. Burned-out tanks stood like skeletons. The few prisoners taken were too numb to resist. They did not speak, did not even raise their hands. They simply sat where they were, staring at nothing. Those who witnessed the event from afar would carry its memory for the rest of their lives. It was not a battle, but an execution carried out by mathematics and steel. The German officers who survived that day would later admit that from that moment forward, they stopped believing in victory. And as the smoke drifted higher into the Normandy sky, the silence that followed seemed heavier than the sound that had come before. When the guns fell quiet, the valley near Falaise looked like the end of the world. What had once been green farmland was now a vast field of blackened craters, each still smoking from the heat of explosions. The air shimmered with rising waves of dust and ash. The smell of burned metal and flesh clung to everything. Even the wind seemed unwilling to move through the devastation. The few surviving German officers stumbled among the wreckage, their uniforms coated in soot, their eyes wide and hollow. Some tried to gather the remnants of their units, shouting names into the haze, but no one answered. The artillery had erased entire formations. Platoons, regiments, and battalions that had existed for years were gone in minutes. The earth itself had swallowed them. American forward observers watched the aftermath through their binoculars, recording the results with clinical precision. They reported destroyed convoys, halted movements, and no further enemy activity observed. To them, it was confirmation that the mission had succeeded. To the Germans below, it was a vision of hell. One officer wrote afterward that he felt as though the mountains themselves had fallen upon us. Another described walking across the field and realizing that the road had turned into a grave. What made the destruction even more unbearable was its silence. After 20 minutes of unimaginable noise, the sudden absence of sound left men disoriented. Survivors could hear their own breathing, the distant crackle of fire, and the groans of the wounded. Some crawled through the wreckage looking for comrades, but most of what they found were fragments. A torn sleeve, a melted helmet, a hand protruding from a crater. The scale was beyond comprehension. As the day wore on, the full extent of the annihilation became clear. Entire divisions were missing from the maps. German field communications fell into chaos, messages repeating the same desperate words. We cannot move. We cannot escape. Officers from the valley. War correspondents who arrived days later described scenes that defied language. A corridor of death stretching for miles, where every step revealed something terrible. Trucks stood upright, their drivers still in their seats, frozen by the blast. Horses lay in twisted heaps. Fields that once grew wheat were now filled with burned-out armor. Among the German officers captured afterward were men who had fought since 1939, veterans of Poland, France, and Russia. Yet none of them had seen anything like this. They were men who had once spoken confidently about tactics and honor, now reduced to trembling silence. One American sergeant who escorted a group of prisoners noted that they walked like ghosts, their faces blank, their boots dragging as if they no longer cared whether they lived. The psychological impact was devastating. In the interrogation tents, some officers broke down when describing the barrage. One colonel wept openly, saying that it was not war, but slaughter by thunder. Others simply refused to speak, staring into the ground as if afraid to remember. Reports from Allied intelligence noted that the prisoners suffered from extreme exhaustion, shock, and disassociation. They had not only lost the battle, they had lost their faith in the army itself. That day at Falaise marked the breaking point of the German war in France. The Wehrmacht had entered Normandy with nearly 400,000 men. Within weeks, more than half were dead, wounded, or captured. The artillery barrage that morning symbolized that collapse in its most brutal form. Not just destruction, but erasure. From that point onward, the German army would never again recover the initiative in the West. For the Americans, the success was undeniable but sobering. Officers who walked through the aftermath spoke in low voices. Some took photographs for records. Others refused. A few stood for long minutes looking over the valley, unable to reconcile the silence with the memory of the sound. They had witnessed efficiency perfected, but it no longer felt like victory. One lieutenant remarked quietly, "If this is what winning looks like, I don't know how peace will ever sound." That night, as darkness settled again over Normandy, the last fire still glowed in the distance. The sky above Falaise flickered orange against the horizon. Somewhere out there, among the ruins, a handful of German soldiers still moved, dazed, searching for escape that no longer existed. Their commanders, those who had survived, sat in the shadows, unable to sleep. Some wrote short, broken notes in field journals that would later be found among their effects. The words repeated one sentiment again and again. "We saw everything end today." The artillery had done what no army could undo. The men who witnessed it would carry that sound forever. In the days following the barrage, Allied troops advanced cautiously into the valley that had once been the heart of the German retreat route. What they found defied imagination. The destruction stretched for miles, a wasteland of shattered vehicles, burned bodies, and twisted metal. Reporters described it as a graveyard of an army. The soldiers who entered Falaise did not cheer. They whispered. The victory was total, but the price of witnessing it was heavy. American engineers began clearing paths through the debris. They worked silently, pushing aside the wreckage of tanks and trucks that still smoldered from the inferno. Each movement of a shovel or bulldozer revealed another grim reminder of what had happened. Helmets melted to the earth, rifles fused together by heat, and the remains of horses still harnessed to wagons. Many of the men had to stop and look away. It was not a battlefield anymore. It was a scene of industrial death. The official reports listed staggering numbers. Within just 20 minutes of concentrated shelling, more than 8,000 German soldiers were confirmed dead or missing. In the larger Falaise pocket, over 50,000 were captured, and another 10,000 lay dead across the countries. Day. The artillery fire that had rained down that morning had destroyed not only men and machines, but the last organized German defense in northern France. The road to Paris was now open. For the Wehrmacht, the psychological blow was irreversible. Survivors were rounded up in groups, most too stunned to resist. Allied interrogators described them as exhausted to the point of collapse. Some officers wept openly, others simply stared into space, their faces blank. They had lived through the greatest mechanized onslaught they had ever seen, and many could not explain how they had survived. A captured lieutenant from the 2nd Panzer Division told his interrogator that it was as if the heavens exploded. In the aftermath, German command tried to downplay the disaster. Official communiques mentioned heavy fighting and strategic withdrawal, but the truth was already clear. The Western Front had been irreparably broken. Hitler raged from his headquarters in East Prussia, blaming his generals for incompetence, but even he understood the scale of the loss. The once proud divisions that had driven through France in 1940 were now reduced to scattered remnants, incapable of defense or counterattack. Meanwhile, American artillery units that had executed the barrage received commendations for their precision and coordination. But among the men themselves, there was no celebration. Many had nightmares for weeks afterward. The sound of the guns, the sight of the valley after the smoke cleared, these were not images that faded. In field letters, some gunners wrote of feeling both pride and guilt. One soldier described it as a moment where you realize that war is nothing but organized horror. Civilians returning to the region after the battle faced their own heartbreak. Villages near Falaise had been reduced to rubble, farms destroyed, and roads littered with the wreckage of war. French locals spoke in hushed tones about the inferno that had consumed the German columns. Some pitied the soldiers. Others saw it as justice for the years of occupation. Either way, No one who saw the valley forgot what it looked like. In the Allied archives, the event was recorded clinically. Enemy losses severe, operation complete. Yet behind those sterile words lay the memories of men who had seen what complete destruction looked like. Historians later described it as one of the most concentrated and effective artillery actions of the entire war. But for those who had been there, the statistics were meaningless. The haunting question remained: how could so much death occur in so little time? That question would follow both the victors and the defeated as they moved beyond Normandy, into the final phase of the war in Europe. A war that now seemed destined to end, not with honor, but with exhaustion. Weeks after the bombardment, the full magnitude of what happened near Falaise began to settle into history. Military analysts from both sides studied the event with cold precision. But even in their technical language, there was a sense of awe. The Americans had demonstrated the devastating power of modern artillery coordination, a perfect union of mathematics, communication, and timing. Each gun crew had fired blind, guided only by coordinates and radio updates, yet their fire had landed with unrelenting accuracy. To the survivors, it felt as if the sky itself had chosen its victims. The Falaise pocket became a symbol of the changing nature of warfare. No longer was victory decided by courage alone or by the maneuver of tanks and infantry. It was now determined by who could bring the greatest firepower to bear in the shortest time. The German army, once famed for its tactical genius and mobility, found itself trapped, immobile, and helpless under the storm of shells. The illusion of control vanished. Technology, ground communication networks. Yet buried within those same documents were quiet acknowledgments of unease. One memo, marked confidential, noted that several artillery crews requested reassignment afterward, citing nervous fatigue and moral distress. Even victory, it seemed, had a price. The psychological residue of the Falaise massacre lingered across both armies. Soldiers on patrol in the weeks after the event would pass through the valley and fall silent. The wind carried the smell of decay long after the fighting ended. Graves registration units worked tirelessly, burying the dead, sometimes hundreds in a single day. The fields had to be cleared before the farmers could return, and even then, unexploded shells remained buried beneath the soil, waiting for years to come. By late September 1944, the German army in France no longer existed as a coherent fighting force. Those who survived retreated toward the Siegfried Line, disorganized and demoralized. The road that had once led to conquest now led only to collapse. For the Americans, the way to Paris was clear. Within days, Allied flags rose over the French capital, and newsreels declared that liberation had come. Yet for those who had seen the Valley of Death at Falaise, liberation carried the shadow of what it had cost. In the official after-action report, the U.S. Army noted the artillery strike near Falaise as one of the most decisive in the European campaign. But the document ended with a simple line that echoed more deeply than the statistics. Enemy resistance was annihilated. No glory, no triumph, just annihilation. Precise, efficient, and final. As historians pieced together the story in the decades that followed, they struggled to capture its full scale. Photographs from reconnaissance planes showed nothing but black scars across the countryside, each marking where human lives had been erased. And moments. To the modern eye, the images still hold power, not as symbols of victory, but as warnings of what industrial war truly means. And so, long after the guns fell silent, the valley, it was a glimpse into the terrifying efficiency of modern war. The American artillery that day did what entire divisions once struggled to accomplish. It erased an army in minutes. But behind that efficiency lay a truth that haunted everyone who saw it, that progress in warfare does not lessen suffering, it magnifies it. For the Wehrmacht officers who survived, the memory never faded. They had entered Normandy believing in discipline, in control, in the order of battle. What they witnessed instead was chaos unleashed by machines, fire without faces, death without warning. Their sleepless nights were not only born from fear, but from realization. The war they had mastered no longer belonged to men. It belonged to technology, to the cold precision of mathematics and steel. For the Americans, the victory at Falaise symbolized both triumph and moral weight. The men who fired those guns understood they had helped end the war faster, yet many carried the burden of what they'd seen. Some returned home as heroes, but could never explain the silence that followed the barrage, that hollow space where pride and horror coexist. In that silence, they understood something profound about power, that the ability to destroy carries with it an unending responsibility to remember. History would later write of Falaise as the closing of the trap, a decisive blow that broke the German army in the West. But those who were there knew it was also something else. The day when victory and devastation became indistinguishable. When men realized that in modern war, there are no winners, only survivors. The valley still exists, quiet and green again, its scars hidden beneath grass and time. Farmers plow the same soil where thousands once fell, and travelers pass unaware of the ground's memory. Yet if you stand there at dusk, when the air grows still and the light fades across the hills, you can almost feel the weight of what happened, the echo of guns that once turned the earth into fire. It is a silence born not from peace, but from remembrance. And it reminds us that even in victory, war leaves no hearts untouched.